Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's programme, Grant Shapps, the government's Transport Secretary and former chairman of the Conservative Party, Labour's Shadow Secretary for International Trade and former Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry. Joining us down the line, Nadra Ahmed, Executive Chairman of the National Care Association and someone who's worked in social care for the past 35 years. Kate Clanchy, award-winning poet, teacher and winner of the Orwell Prize for political writing for her book, Some Kids I Taught and What They Taught Me. And journalist, ex-political editor of The Sun newspaper, now presenter and chief political commentator for Times Radio, Tom Newton Dunn. Good evening, welcome to my guests here in the studio. Nadra, welcome to you, joining us down the line, very good to see you. To our audience, our virtual audience, QT50, very good to see you. And you at home, do you notice anything different? We've got our desk back, which is actually rather exciting. Very good to see you as well. Do join in the conversation in the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time. Right, we'll take our first question, which is from PS.
Thank you, Fiona. Dominic Cummings said yesterday about the pandemic, tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. Do you agree?
Emily Thornberry.
I think the truth is that it was pretty chaotic to start with. I think that the government didn't really know what to do. It wasn't expecting this. There was no file to open to tell them exactly how to do things. I understand that. I was supportive of the government, wanting them to succeed. I think what was scary about Dominic Cummings' evidence was that it seemed to be clear that chaos continued. You know, in the end, we as a country have done really well. We have brilliant scientists who invented a vaccine really quickly, faster than anybody believed that anyone really would be able to do. We've got our brilliant National Health Service that has been able to vaccinate most of the nation in top fast time. What we wanted from our politicians and from our government was timely decisions and clear leadership with clear messaging. And I'm afraid the truth is that time and time again, they have failed to do that, and they continue to fail to do that.
And do you think people died needlessly who otherwise would have survived because of that?
I think
that's the question.
I think that after 10 years of cutting back on the number of beds, when we had the pandemic hit, we were 15,000 beds shorter than we had been 10 years before. I think that there was an instruction went out to clear the beds as fast as we could and to push people into social care. And we know that there were not enough people tested before they went into care homes, and when they did go into care homes, we know that people became infected.
So is the answer yes or no?
I think that if we lived in a perfect world, which we don't, and if the government had done the right thing right from the start, which I quite understand, it was chaotic and confusing to start with, then many more people would have survived, which is why we need to make sure that we have an inquiry that not only tells the truth to all those people who lost relatives, but also so that we have lessons to learn and to make sure that next time we are ready and we don't make the same mistakes again.
There's a few hands up already, so I'm going to come straight to our audience, actually. Andrea.
Yeah, I just want to say that the fact that so many people came from hospitals to care homes, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that that is just wrong. And the result of that is that so many people lost their lives, and we've got so many families still grieving. And I think the government needs to take ownership of that. And it's just not okay to say you can pass that hot potato around the table and nobody's taking ownership of it. It happened, and everybody knew it was happening, and it's not enough just to say that, oh, we need to have an inquiry. It was clearly wrong. Everybody knew it at the time. And, you know, people that were responsible for that need to own up to it.
Jack?
Yeah, thank you. I am shocked, frankly, that not only was it chaotic at the very start, which, as has been said, is almost understandable because this is a very frightening, uncertain crisis. But to then go on and make the same mistakes, and as the testimony yesterday kind of laid out, was based on the evidence that was presented, that was then ignored by the instincts of Boris Johnson, allegedly.
You're talking about the later lockdowns.
Surely, yeah, exactly. Surely there must be questions asked about the decision-making process the entire way through the pandemic. And indeed the decisions that are still being made today by the same people.
Martin?
I think, firstly, it's nice to hear Emily not just kind of have a go at the government. It's nice to get some coherent conversation going. I think the government, the first lockdown was, it was bad, but who could prepare for it? I think the problem comes in where the second lockdown occurs and the mixed messaging and the flip-flopping and the hokey-cokey, as we've heard before. I think that's where we need scrutiny, not the initial lockdown. I think that's the area that needs our full attention.
And P.S., let me ask you, since you put the question in the first place, and what you made of what you heard yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to know who to believe because it's a difficult choice to decide whether to believe politicians or to believe politicians' at the time best friend who's now scorned and has an axe to grind. You almost really don't want to believe either of them because, chances are the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think, like with all of these things, there's probably at least an element of truth in what he said, but it's probably not to the extent of what he said, because if it was, he would have been in a position to perhaps change it, or at least he should have resigned trying to change it rather than letting it go on for over a year.
And you asked the question, P.S., do you think tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die?
So I don't know, Fiona. I mean, we know tens of thousands of people died, and we know that mistakes were made in terms of not having enough PPE, especially for frontline health workers as well as social care workers. We know that people, as another audience member said, were put into the community too quickly. But we also, and again, like the other audience member said, I'm actually quite impressed with Emily Thornberry's answer because normally you just expect Labour to just criticise the government outright. But actually, as someone that was in and is in the healthcare industry, we were there when it started and it was chaos and nobody really knew anything about how to deal with it in a better way. So I think the government were caught scrambling around, trying to do the best that they could. Clearly mistakes were made and lessons were learned and lots of people died. And I think, that is the real tragedy that, we didn't have the PPE we needed. We didn't have the testing. We didn't have the vaccinations till now. But we are, of course, in a much, much better place now.
So, Grant Shapps, let me put the question to you then. You've got Dominic Cummings saying yesterday that tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. You've got one of the government's key advisors, Professor Neil Ferguson, saying the same thing. Do you agree?
No, I don't, actually, but for all the reasons that Emily was saying, which is, and many of the audience members have mentioned, which is, this is a virus for which there was no handbook, there was no textbook for how to cope with it. I actually agree with a lot of the comments that have been made about the lack of PPE, for example. We didn't even produce PPE in this country, whereas now we're producing 75% of it.
I mean, the Health Secretary has said, and it's attracted some controversy, this statement, not least yesterday, that there was never a national shortage of PPE.
Well, certainly we were having to pull in PPE from around the world, and I think now we've got more than ample supply. But, I mean, it is a fact that at the time we were experienced at regularly providing PPE for 238 NHS trusts. Now we provide PPE for 58,000 different health locations. So it gives you an idea of the extent to which we've had to expand this up. And just going back to the decision making at the time, because I think, actually very welcome to have a very sensible conversation about this. Of course we didn't get everything right. Of course we didn't.
And does that include, therefore, people dying who needlessly?
No, I was going to say, but, actually we were also doing things which were taking risks in some ways. For example, putting money and research and time and effort into vaccines and then manufacturing them before knowing whether they were going to work or not, which now, at this end, a year later, we're seeing the benefits from. So we've got some things incredibly right, and there will have been things that, goodness knows, if we had only known at the time, for example, back in March 2020, that a third of people with coronavirus are asymptomatic, that would have made a very big difference to our response. That science wasn't there at the time,
yes, it was.
and knowing that would have made a very, very big difference to do. Well, Jenny Harris said it wasn't today at the press conference, and she is, as you know, the head of Test and Trace. And,
well, I've seen
and she said at the time, we didn't have that information. If we'd had it, then of course the response would be different. But, I don't think it's right to sit here after such a global pandemic and catastrophe for the world and somehow try to claim that everything is fine. That is absolute nonsense.
And can I just check, does Matt Hancock have the confidence of the Prime Minister?
Yes, he does, because actually, not just with the vaccines, which I've mentioned, but also with things like the ability for each and every one of us watching this to take 2 separate coronavirus tests a week.
OK, but the question... no, but hang on, we're getting well away from the question. The question is about, did people die who didn't need to die? It's about the past, not about the vaccine programme.
I've been very honest about where I think things went wrong. You can't just stop me when I'm explaining something which I think were difficult
you've told us
decisions
that the vaccine programme has been got right and no one's going to take issue with it.
I'm talking about the coronavirus tests and also things like our ability to genome sequence, which are things which have gone right. So we have to look at this in the round, which is why it's right to have a full, independent public inquiry, and it's exactly what we said we're going to do.
Nadra Ahmed.
Yes, I think it's a huge challenge to answer a question like that about unnecessary deaths, because I think when you look at it, we were not prepared for this pandemic, and why would we be? We didn't see it coming around the corner. We know that there were signs of it coming through the world, but when it actually arrived on our shores, I think there was some scepticism about how challenging it was going to be. But I think there were mistakes made, and I think certainly within social care, we know that actually we were ignored, and we ended up being that forgotten frontline. So PPE being diverted away from our services was enormous. An enormous issue for us, where providers were paying £8,500 for a week's worth of PPE because our PPE, our suppliers, had been diverted to supply to the NHS for the very reason that Grant has just raised, that we didn't have the supply. So actually, we put social care on the altar to be slaughtered, whilst we worked on the mantra that the NHS must be protected. And I absolutely understand why we needed the NHS to be running in the way that it was, because we didn't know what was coming around the corner. I think what we didn't know was the consequence of ignoring social care.
And Nadra, can I ask you, do you agree then with Matt Hancock's comment? Again, this is another thing that's attracted some controversy, that he threw a protective shield around care homes.
Absolutely not. It's absolute rubbish. There was no shield around. I think that was an utterance that came about in a form of embarrassment, perhaps, because nothing had been done for social care.
Well, it's an utterance that he's repeated a number of times, Nadra. I mean, do you think a number of people have said this, but I'm just wondering, do you think he should resign then?
Well, I don't think it's a resigning matter in this, and it's not for me to decide. I think it's about ensuring that we talk about the issues rather than think about uttering things that are untrue. That is not true. There was no protective shield. We know that. We were working the floor. If there'd been a protective shield, there would have been a plan to support the most vulnerable people, the people that we look after.
Tom.
Can I possibly be so bold to interpret Grant Shapps' comments there? When he said...
But also answer the question at some point.
I'm going to do precisely the same at the same time. When Grant said, of course, people didn't die who didn't need to die, what he meant to say was, of course they did. Of course, tens of thousands of people didn't have to die. And I'll explain why. I think you might have misspoke a bit there, Grant. We all agree that the death toll should have been less. The question that we're debating potentially is why. Is who to blame. The entire pandemic has been a learning curve, and I think you've just said that yourself. We didn't know about symptomatic transmission. We didn't know it was particularly a great idea not to allow people out of hospital into care homes without testing them. We didn't know to build a testing system. All of that. The question is blame, and I think you have to take into account that the government had no manual to do this. I think a lot of people have sympathy for the predicament every government in the world were put in. But Dominic Cummings' evidence yesterday, if you take aside all the personal abuse, because there's a lot of that, there was a lot of clear, grievance settling and vengeful words towards the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary, there were two really interesting points for me that he brought out. One was the system that existed in March, February, January 2020 was just simply not up to scratch. It was hopeless. You couldn't even get a laptop in Cobra that worked. You couldn't get internet reception, so they had to resort to blackboards on the wall. And the second thing is, about that system, it was incapable of learning. I think Cummings put that across very powerfully. We saw the Far East, we saw immediate lockdowns, pretty draconian measures, and it was decided for months that that wouldn't work in Britain. For me, the system was found completely lacking, and if we can point the blame anywhere for too many deaths, it's probably at that.
Kate.
Saying that we didn't know about that if we put ill people in care homes, they might infect other people. We did know things. Where we and Public Health England had been existing for many decades, and it did know things about quarantine, about infectious diseases, and about how to contact their local community. But the government didn't contact them and didn't use those networks. I mean, one of the things that totally amazed me was that the SAGE committee didn't know that most care workers work in more than one care home. Yeah. And it took all the way till this autumn until we had put some provision in place so that people just had to work in one care home. I don't know how many infections would have resulted from that. Maybe Nadra could tell me. But that seems to me a big issue and something that we genuinely did know about, and a way where we genuinely could have saved lives.
And do you think, I mean, the question is, was Dominic Cummings right to say tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die?
I don't know how you can put numbers on things. I had the experience of losing both my parents in the pandemic, and I would not blame Matt Hancock for that, or say that I don't think that they necessarily needed to die. I think they would have expected to have died at some point in the year.
But the pandemic made it much harder.
The pandemic turned it into a terrible experience, and I think that if we're going to have an accounting of this, that some of those experiences of what death is might be counted in too, not just the numbers. You know, listening to Dominic Cummings, it's a very small clique of men talking about numbers and blaming each other, and I don't see how that's going to do us a lot of good.
Yeah. Okay. Charlie.
I think part of it. Sorry, Kate, to hear about that as well. We understand as the public, we understand that mistakes were made and things happened, but I think a lot of it was to do with what we're getting upset about is the presentation that was put across at media briefings that was trying to make us believe that the government had control. We knew they didn't, but it just tried to confuse us into a way of thinking otherwise.
Yeah. Carlos?
Well, I wouldn't put a number on it, but I'm afraid I do think there have been unavoidable deaths and the government is responsible. I mean, when they say that back before the first lockdown, there was no evidence and no clues as to how to deal with it, it had already ravaged some of Europe. Back in Spain, before our first lockdown, people were already wearing masks. They were having the same problems in care homes and with PPE. So I don't swallow the excuse that they couldn't see it coming. The instinct was wrong. Over here, it felt like it's not going to make it through the Channel Tunnel. It's not going to get here. And that instinct was wrong.
Sean?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the ring that was supposedly put around care homes was, as has already been discussed, totally non-existent. And quite frankly, I don't think the government cared about either care workers or the elderly people in the care homes. I think it was just seen as the easiest target of the people that needed, you know, in their eyes, that were going to die anyway.
What I wanted to say is, a lot of what Dominic Cummings said, we don't know whether it was right or not, whether it's true or not, who knows. You know, I certainly don't want Dominic Cummings to have the last word on this, which is why I think we should have the inquiry going in June, where we actually get some proper evidence being seen. If Dominic Cummings has got evidence to back up what he has to say, then let's call him and let's have questions asked. There's lots of other witnesses that we should have as well. But, you know, some of the things that he says does kind of ring true. So when we hear about what happened with care homes and then we hear him claim that the Prime Minister said, oh, well, it's only people in their 80s who are dying from COVID, it kind of seems to ring true because of the attitude towards social care. But what I wanted to say was, we also need to be well aware of the fact that more people died during the second wave than during the first wave. And actually, whilst we can say, well, look, it was chaotic and difficult, you know, when it first arrived, come September, when the evidence was perfectly clear, where the instructions from SAGE was perfectly clear, the government was still holding back on having another lockdown when we absolutely needed it. And if they had locked down at the time when they should have, then I certainly think that many, many lives would have been saved.
Grant, let me come back to something that Nadra said. Nadra said that the claim by Matthew Hancock that we put a shield around people in care homes is rubbish. Do you agree with Nadra, the head of the National Care Home Association, or do you agree with the Health Secretary?
I think what Matt was probably trying to say was that there were a series of things that were done in order to try to put protocols in place.
And you've got the head of the National Care Association saying that claim is rubbish. Do you agree with her, or do you agree with your colleague?
If I can get more than 5 seconds out here, I can...
No, I'm just asking a very specific question,
I know,
that's
but
all.
it requires a little bit more than a yes-no answer, because the point I'm trying to make is care homes, as Nadra said, didn't have access to PPE. That's because, and most people won't be aware of this, care homes had always traditionally purchased their own PPE. Several people have already mentioned that as a country, we didn't have PPE, we didn't have a manufacturing base, we didn't have the ability to test people, let alone the vaccines. So
you had warehouses with rubber gloves.
No, there were lots of mitigating factors, but who do you agree with, Matt Hancock or Nadra Ahmed?
So what I was going to say is, so the attempt to throw the protective shield, and again, I refer back to what Jenny Harries said today, head of Test and Trace, which is that the infections to care homes largely came through care home workers and people coming into the care homes, not from the transfers from hospitals.
How does she know
well, I'm merely quoting today.
How does she know that? They weren't doing test and trace.
Let Nadra back in.
And I'm merely quoting her, but she
that.
used the phrase today that it was a tiny number that came through hospitals.
But I notice you haven't answered the question.
But hold on,
Grant.
in hospitals, just another thing as well, when people go to care homes, there's a protocol to do with infection control, which isn't entirely reliant on whether somebody has an infection or not. So I think when Matt Hancock said those words, he was referring to the wider protocols and the wider activity going on, including as soon as was possible, because we'd started to produce the... as soon as we started to produce the tests in sufficient number to do it, they were aimed at care homes.
Let's hear from Nadra. What's your response to that?
Well, so from what Grant is saying, it was okay to then divert the PPE away from social care providers into the NHS. Was that the right thing to do? Because you didn't have it, so you thought you would take it from our suppliers and go into the NHS, therefore exposing the social care sector even more. Because you're right, we have always purchased our own PPE. We've always done that. We've not looked for handouts. That's what we do. The decision was made that it was all going to be diverted. And I know this because I had a supplier contact me and tell me he could not supply to our members because his supplies were being diverted to the NHS. The bit about the shield, I really want to, he actually specifically said it was a protective shield around social care. A protective shield. What does that tell you? Because it wasn't true.
It wasn't true.
Well, do you accept it wasn't true? I'm giving you one last chance to answer.
Thank you. Well,
without all the mitigating factors, just was it true or not?
On the 19th of March, there's fresh guidance provided for discharging requirements. On the 2nd of April, there were admission to care home guidance provided for what to do with symptomatic residents. On the 15th of April...
And testing didn't come in until the 15th of April.
But this was a developing situation. And so at each stage, in addition to providing, in the end, billions of pieces, but as soon as they were available, pieces of PPE to the care home sector, which, as I've already mentioned, was never a function of the government. So the government
So shall we take it then that you don't agree with Nadra? I've got to get one way or the other. Do you agree with her or not about the protective shield being rubbish?
The intention, at least, was to protect as far as we possibly could, and this idea, and I'm sorry, just to challenge one of the audience members, this idea that any government, it doesn't matter what colour the government is, wouldn't care, and that people in public office wouldn't lie awake at night working out how best to save a country from a pandemic, I'm afraid is completely untrue.
A couple of quick points. First, I think when Matt Hancock said we have put a shield around care homes, what he meant was we are going to. And what he says, when he got in trouble with the Prime Minister for potentially misleading him, was another coming suggestion of we are testing people coming out of hospital going into care homes. What he meant to say is we're trying to.
Well, of course, we can't know what he meant to say. We only know what he actually did say.
From what we can gather, it feels like Matt Hancock might have got the wrong tense on these various things. But I just want to pick up on Charlie's point about transparency. I think it was a really excellent one. As journalists throughout this entire pandemic for the last 14 months, and I think we're still doing it slightly, perhaps with some grants numbers for the travel list, which you might learn more about next week. We've tried so hard to find out exactly what the government's numerics are, why they're making their decisions, and throughout they've been incredibly defensive. It should have been reasonably straightforward from earlier on to say, look, we don't know what we're doing here, no one knows what we're doing, but we're trying our very damnedest. And I think you might have taken more people with you if you'd just shown a little bit more humility at times.
I think 25,000 people were discharged from hospital without being tested, and that is a number that we should remember.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 more contributions from the audience, then I'm going to move on. Amanda.
Right, firstly, I think, you know, with the best will in the world, people were saying things that they were, and probably were saying the wrong things. But saying that there was a protective shield around old people's homes and care homes and everything like that in our area, the only way that the care homes had protective shields was from our school kids who were making face visors out of their 3D printers, and along with their teachers, and distributing them to all the local care homes because they had nothing. So if that's the protective shield, then the government was doing their job right. It's twaddle. They didn't have anything, so yeah, there was a very lack and belated situation where things were supposed to be happening, but nothing ever did happen. Okay. And you know, the face masks, the PPEs, they were being made by the locals. So that's the only protection that any of our people homes had.
All right. Let's hear from someone else.
Nothing from the government.
Thank you, Amanda. Sherry.
I'd say that to say we were slow is the understatement of the century. I mean, Wuhan was in lockdown in January, and it seems to me, or I thought at the time, that everyone's hoping it's never going to get here, so we won't do anything until it does. So to say we had no signs is ridiculous.
Ariane?
The government has been in power for over 10 years. So to say there wasn't PPE equipment, why wasn't there? And we were told right at the beginning of the pandemic, before we had lockdowns and things like that, that we weren't to worry because the government was already prepared and it had PPE equipment. The other thing that concerns me an awful lot is that, having listened very carefully to Dominic Cummings, yes, maybe he told lies, maybe he didn't, but there are things that ring slightly true. For example, I can remember when we were being told how many items of PPE there were, you were counting one glove as one item, as opposed to counting a whole load of PPE equipment as one item.
Okay, thank you. I can see from the hands up that we could talk about this probably for the entire hour. I'm not going to, probably to your relief, Grant, perhaps. We're going to move on and take another question from Tony. Tony Cowan.
Yes, good evening, Fiona, and good evening, panel. The question I have is, after the Dyson report, can the BBC regain the confidence of the public?
Tom.
Yes, it can. The BBC is a great institution. I don't think any of us would be here if we didn't believe that. I'm pleased the BBC exists. I happen to work for a rival broadcaster, but I have friends who work for the BBC. I consume the BBC. I think the Bashir scandal has shown us both the best of the BBC and the worst of the BBC. The best is watching my colleagues on Today programme, on BBC Breakfast, on the full plethora of channels. And indeed, Question Time right now, try and hold their own management to account. Every single morning, hearing my friend Nick Robinson or Justin Webb saying, well, we try to get the management on to talk to us about why on earth they made such a mess, but they won't come on. I liked hearing that. So good on the BBC journalism. The management, I think, and their flaws that the Dyson report has exposed has been the worst of the BBC. The arrogance, the conceit, the sort of failure to answer basic questions when the report came out. And I think we'll hear this next week when there's a future report. But when Martin Bashir was a rogue journalist, acting, it would appear, on his own, doing some pretty unethical, awful things with dire consequences, the cover-up, I think we can call it that, after the panoramic expose on his forged documents, and then the decision to rehire him was quite extraordinary. I mean,
in 2016.
In 2016, some 3 years after he was fired by a US network for suggesting that someone needed to defecate in Sarah Palin's mouth. I mean, that should have been a warning sign then and there. So the management really needs some serious questions asked them, and it's a bit trite perhaps, but you know, heads rolling might show some sense of responsibility. So far, no heads are rolled. Martin Bashir has been allowed to walk away with his notice money still in his pocket, which does seem quite extraordinary. So yes, it can win back some confidence, but it needs to, again, show some humility and show it's really learned the lessons.
Grant.
Well, first of all, I think it's actually helpful that we've had this further review. The Dyson review, I think, was ordered by the new leadership of the BBC, and that in itself may be a good point. I agree with Tom's comment about the fact that we all want the BBC to succeed as an organisation. The failures were pretty damning. The fact that there have been previous investigations that have, simply, it seems, attempted to cover up what happened.
Well, it was described as woefully ineffective.
Indeed. Very concerning, and the report was pretty damning. I think from a practical point of view, everybody wants to get this back on track, and what we're going to have is a mid-term review of the Charter. I think it's in 20 to 24, and that will sort of review whether there needs to be some form of oversight. I don't mean from government, I mean from something that comes from the BBC.
I mean, the government has been very critical of the BBC. Noticeably so. I mean, is it going to take the mid-term Charter review as an opportunity to look at the governance again? Yeah. I mean, it's certainly suggested that.
Yeah, the whole point of having the review is to review it, clearly. I mean, I think we collectively recognise the value of having a high-quality national broadcaster. And we're not sort of gunning for it in that sense, but we do want to see matters put right. I mean, after all, that whole incident was the sort of thing that Panorama itself spends its life looking into. They found out in the BBC something had gone terribly wrong and then covered that up in itself. So that's clearly unacceptable. And I think some sort of system which means that there's truly independent oversight rather than it going to the same people who sort of say, well, there's nothing to see here and let's move on. Would be valuable. But we want to see the BBC recover from this, and I think the fact that it's new leadership that got us this far is actually important.
Kate, what's your view? Can the BBC regain the confidence of the public?
Well, I certainly hope so, because we really need them. I mean, I don't have such faith that the government is pretty pro-BBC, partly because of what happened with the BBC World Service, which was is such an important source of truth and fact-checking, and the massive cut of handing it onto the licence fee instead of paying it through the Foreign Office. I found that quite a shaking thing. Yeah. Everything, all the stories we have today, everything we pick up, every issue of Question Time tells us that we need a source of news that we can trust, where people are accountable to the public, to the government, to have their news checked.
And has this shaken your trust?
Well, I was more shaken by the Carrie Gracie scandal, actually.
On equal pay?
On equal pay, when I realised kind of how big the establishment was. And I hope, because this, as I say, this year does seem one rogue journalist. They should have sorted him out, but it seems to be the same old boys club that covered the Carrie Gracie scandal. And I do hope, but at least they are being held to account. They are holding themselves to account, and we, the public, are holding them to account. So I really hope that they can survive this, yes.
Let's see what our audience thinks. There's a few hands up. Claire?
I accept what people are saying about the BBC, and I too would like it to recover, but I think there's a much bigger theme here, which is failure of governance in large organisations in this country. We've seen it with the Post Office, we've seen it with numerous NHS trusts, we've seen it with the Home Office, we saw it with our banks in 2008. And I wonder if the thread that doesn't link all of these things, I wonder whether that isn't failure of accountability of management, who seem to move on to more jobs with no sanctions whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dale.
It's time and time again with the BBC. Obviously, this is not the first time it's happened, and it probably won't be the last. So now we've got to think about the Royal Charter and whether the licence payer needs to pay this, or now it needs to go to like the ITV model, an advertising model where they have to earn the finances they get in, and the presenters need to earn the salary that they have. Because at the
and is that what you'd like to happen, that the BBC switches to advertising?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Sorry, Fiona. I think you need to work for your money. Sorry.
I didn't realise I wasn't. Anyway, you are more than entitled to your view, Dale.
No, but I do think now it's time to look at the Royal Charter and it's time to scrap that. People have moved on. We're now doing a streaming service. We've got likes of Netflix. We've got likes of everything else, Disney Prime and all that kind of stuff. The BBC is an old network that doesn't really fit the model as a 21st century. And that's what I think now it's time to kind of move on from that and look at it. And what has happened with the Bashir, that's the tip of the iceberg, because that was wrong on so many levels. And the BBC shouldn't be awarded by that, by licence fee payers, because we have to pay it. Yeah. They need to now look at that as a Royal Charter.
All right. Richard.
Fiona, I think here we're looking at, it's not so much BBC as an institution that's wrong. You've got naughty boys and naughty girls who are working in this institution. You're always going to have that. And I think Claire hit the nail on the head, that those people should be the ones that really get punished and really get the book thrown at them. What he did was incredibly wrong, but not nearly as wrong as what happened a few years ago to a guy who didn't live so far from me up here. And really, that should have been really bad.
And what are you referring to exactly,
so
Richard?
Accountability. Pardon?
What are you referring to exactly, Richard?
The Jimmy Savile stuff from
right.
a few years ago,
right.
where it was reported time after time that something was going on, and it took until way after his death for it to really come to fruition. But why did it take so long? Where is that accountability? Where is that responsibility? And this is where I think the problem is. You're always going to have the reputation of the BBC. I don't think is in too bad a shape. You're always going to get naughty people. How do those people get brought to bear?
Okay. Emily?
I think what you've just said is really interesting. I agree, actually, with what you've just said. I think that Claire is right, too, that we need to look again at management and accountability. And I think that if this midterm review is going to do that, then I don't have a problem with it. I think it's the sort of thing that should happen. I think we have to remember that whilst this was a terrible thing that happened, I mean, terrible dishonesty that happened, it was 25 years ago, and we must make sure that changes have happened and have been the appropriate changes. But we also must not allow what has happened to give licence to certain Tory ministers who, frankly, have got a long-term agenda when it comes to undermining the BBC. I personally love the BBC. I love its independence, and I love the fact that it is a source of truth. Because in this day of fake news, we need somewhere. And actually, we have a great advantage as British people of having an institution like the BBC. It doesn't just serve our country, it also serves the world. I know that there have been wars declared and people have turned from various other news channels that are on it and switched on to the BBC because they know that they will get the truth from the BBC. We should be proud of that. We should be proud of that and make sure that we support it properly and not allow it to be undermined. That does not mean that it is given a free pass. And as Claire has said, you know, when management lets us down, we should be clear about that. But the institution and the fact that it is independent, it doesn't need to chase ratings, and that it is publicly funded and it belongs to us is good. I'm really pleased about it. We must not allow it to be undermined.
What's wrong with chasing ratings?
I think that there's room for news outlets that chase ratings. Of course there is. But I think that what we need to have is we need to have a pillar which doesn't chase ratings, which is just about truth, and it is just making sure that we know that if we want to be able to find out what's really going on, you know, we don't just get comment, we don't just get opinions, we can find out what's really going on by switching on to the BBC.
Let me hear from Nadra. Nadra, can the BBC regain the confidence of the public?
I think so, and I agree with voices that have already spoken. I think it is a respected voice. And
the Dyson Review, has that not shaken your confidence in that, what you call a respected voice?
Well, I think what it's shaken my confidence in is the background work that was done on that particular programme and other programmes where vulnerable people were the centre. And I think that's where we've got to be very careful when you are securing exclusives, then what was the audit trail around making sure that the information that was gathered was accurate? And in this case, obviously, we know that it was falsified. But we can't assume that every documentary that's ever made is going to go down that route, because we know there are some fabulous journalists, and I work with a lot of the BBC journalists on a number of stories through this pandemic and before on the state of social care, and we get really good balanced views around it. And I think across the world, wherever I am, I agree with Emily, wherever I am or have been, I haven't been out of the country for a while, I will turn on to the BBC in order to make sure that I'm kept up to date. And that's true all across. So I think it has to recover. I think the models have to change. I think they do have to look at that management and maybe bring it. I mean, this is an opportunity. They need to see it as an opportunity to bring itself into the 21st century and move forward and make sure they continue to make the fabulous documentaries and programmes that they do.
OK, let's take another question now from Andrea McSherry.
Thanks, Fiona. Tuesday marked a year since George Floyd's death. What have we learned in that time?
Grant.
Well, I mean, first of all, that it's good to see that justice was done in the US. I think it was kind of very important that there was a trial which came to a conclusion, and that's all happened within the year. Secondly, that you know, the battle to kind of bring justice to people from every background never ends. I mean, this is just an ongoing fight, which we all, I think, are born thinking shouldn't exist, but actually does have to be fought on a daily basis. Now, the context is a bit different. That was the United States. It's a bit different here, but nonetheless, we have to constantly remind ourselves of the different, different degrees of approaches that are taken. There was a third report this week in the disparities on coronavirus, for example, and there were some good things in there and there were some bad things. The good news is actually on things like uptake of coronavirus vaccines. People from ethnic minority backgrounds are coming forward in much larger numbers. The number of black adults who've come forward has been twice the level since February of the general population.
There was also a report this week commissioned by the government, the Seeing Islamophobia report, which said said claims of institutional racism were not borne out by the evidence. But one of the most prominent Muslims in your party, Baroness Varsi, says the Conservative Party is institutionally racist against Muslims.
Well, actually, like her, I've also been a chair of the party. And I can tell you when I was chair, I do not remember a single incident where somebody came to me with a specific complaint in terms of Islamophobia.
What about your campaign against Sadiq Khan? When Sadiq Khan first stood for Mayor of London, you don't think there was anything in the Conservative campaign for Mayor of London that wasn't the slightest bit Islamophobic?
Well,
Islamophobic. Honestly, honestly.
I mean, the report did say it gives the impression that Tories are insensitive to, Conservatives are insensitive to Muslim communities.
Right. No.
That's your own report.
Right. The point about this is that the report rightly said that there isn't institutional Islamophobia. I have to say, that's very different, Emily, since you attacked me on this, from the reports into the Labour Party, which found institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. But no party, no modern party, should tolerate this. And one of the things the report said is all forms of discrimination are dealt with in the same way. It's just that we need to deal with all of these things better, and not just as parties, but as society as well. And we should strive for it every single day. And, you know, actually, we have a government in this country which has either the first or the second most diverse cabinet in history. I think Boris Johnson's first one was the most diverse cabinet in history. That's good. It shows people that there are no glass ceilings and that you can thrive in this country. But we always need to be doing more.
Nadra, what have we learnt in the year since George Floyd's death?
Well, I think if I look around and I see the different the different ways people are expressing themselves, that certainly has become much more overt in not accepting some of the issues that have been raised following his death, and I agree that it's good to have had the trial and to bring some conclusion to that. But I think when we move forward and we look at how is that changing the world, how is it changing the way that people perceive some of what's going on, and in America it hasn't stopped, it's still going on. We know there are still cases where there have been unnecessary force used on people. I don't know how much it's changed. I feel quite lost about this in many ways, and I think, you know, when I think about the way that we exploit in many ways the diversity of people to actually focus on differences, for example, like Islamophobia. I feel, I mean, the word phobia is that you're afraid of Islam, and I just think that's a misunderstanding of the faith. But how do you then bring that together? That's about people wanting to be to understand the differences, and I don't think we've got into that world yet. And I think that's where our youth is struggling. I think that's where we're having the challenges.
Grant, I just want to pick you. I think you said the EHRC concluded that Labour was institutionally anti-Semitic. I think you said, in fact, they didn't come to that conclusion. They certainly had other conclusions, but not that particular one. Vanessa, I want to come to you. You haven't put your hand up, but you have put your hand up about this subject before. And I just wonder what your view is. What do you think has changed? What have we learned in the last year, if anything? What's your opinion?
Well, I definitely don't think anything has changed. I think it's still an ongoing problem that definitely needs to be addressed.
Do you think things have got any better at all?
Pardon?
Do you think things have got any better at all, or it's about the same?
No, it's exactly the same. I don't think anything's gotten better at all, no.
And what makes you say that? Is that your personal experience or just what you see around you?
Yeah, personal experience, what I've seen around me. I mean, there was a report that came out that said that there is no institutional racism in the UK, which I think is not correct at all.
So this was the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities led by Tony Sewer, which did attract considerable controversy when it came to that conclusion, yes.
Yeah, so it's great that, you know, George's, you know, murder has kind of been brought to justice in a way, but we've not really started to do anything at all.
Okay. Andrea.
Thanks, Fiona. I mean, that dreadful footage of George Floyd's death was truly shocking. And there wasn't just one police officer involved. There's many police officers there. And the message has to be relayed to the corrupt police officers. Obviously, they're not all like that. But the message has to be relayed that this just will not be tolerated. And I agree, I don't think we've come on as far as we could have, but it mustn't be tolerated.
Kate, I just want to ask you, because you've, you know, as a teacher, you've worked with disadvantaged children from many different backgrounds. What do you think we've learned, if anything, in the past year?
I do think it's true that young people feel more empowered to speak up. And to think about their own experience and to name their own experience, and that's a positive thing. But I would echo Vanessa, there's a lot of actual changes that we need to make yet. I mean, you know, in the school curriculum, we certainly need to make some changes. So, for example, that we teach the partition of India in history, yes, as opposed to endlessly teaching the Second World War. Yes. In English, I mean, English lessons, I'm always aware of how few black authors we teach, and yet there's so many wonderful poets of colour, for example, that I would love to teach in the classroom. So I mean, those changes made in my area, and I think there's probably changes that could be made across the board in different areas. Tom?
The question was, what have we learned, or what has changed, I suppose, in the last year? I went to a football match for the first time on Sunday. My beloved Arsenal, I was one of the lucky 10,000 to get back inside the Emirates, Emily's home team up in North London. And just for the kick-off, the 11 players on both sides, the Arsenal team and the Brighton team, knelt. They took the knee. And we've seen this a lot and didn't surprise anybody. And then a certain section of the crowd booed. I was really surprised by that. And it got me thinking, surely, if you've really not learned anything at all in the last year, we can't do that sort of thing anymore. And do you know what? I don't think they would have booed this time last year. What worries me, and I'll answer directly the question, what have we learned? I think we've also learned, as well as all the other good points we've heard, is to keep our eye on the ball. there is racism still in this country. It is not a racist country at all. I think we're a really good open country. There are pockets of it we still have to do more to, but we have to go forward together, because if extremes on both sides of the argument seize the agenda, it starts moving into things like cancel culture, which gets incredibly political, very complicated, very emotional. We're going to get into identity wars and culture wars, and that can push the extremes on the other side, and then they can start booing black football players, a lot of black players on the Arsenal side and the Brighton side, for simply taking the knee. And it's that reaction on both sides that just does trouble me a little bit. I think we need to pull back and try and get back into the centre together.
And if we're talking about football, you've got Marcus Rashford, who is a role model to many by any standards, saying that he'd got 70 tweets of racist abuse, after losing the Europa League final last night. I mean, Emily, do you think we have learned much, we've changed much in the year since
I was
George
going to
Floyd
raise
died?
the issue of Marcus Rashford as well. When one of our national heroes gets 70 incidents of racist abuse in one night. And I think that, Arsenal does great work when it comes to trying to kick racism out of football. But I think sometimes there is a feeling of complacency and a feeling that there is a fuss being made about nothing and that everything is sorted out and that we've moved past it. Well, we haven't. I think that the murder of George Floyd shone a light on racism in the United States, but I think that it set up a fire that went around the world and people started thinking about it in all of their countries. And I think in Britain, at the time, what we could do is look at what had happened in relation to COVID deaths, looked at the pictures of all the people who died and just saw how many of them came from ethnic minorities, and then ask ourselves if there isn't racism in our country. Of course there is. And of course there is much more work that needs to be done. And we just need to work together on it and not believe that it is somehow or other to do with, fluffy youngsters who don't really understand the real world. No, we want to change the world. We want to make it better. We mustn't be complacent. And we've got to keep working at making sure that we become an equal society. And we are an example to the world of how we can all live together.
I'm going to take a last question. I feel, perhaps in true question time tradition, we're going from one extreme to the other in terms of seriousness to light, perhaps. But let's take a question now from Charlie Owens.
Yeah, so after the weighty questions, should we just laugh at the voting in Eurovision, or should we take the competition as seriously as other nations do?
Kate, come on.
Oh, I think that's the best of British, that we laugh at Eurovision. the whole nation sits down and watches it in the spirit of irony. I think it's
even though we keep losing.
Thing. That really doesn't matter if we, I think Iceland were entering the spirit of irony as well, weren't they? They can't have meant that seriously.
Well, you could say about a number of them, but OK, should we say... I mean, Charlie, let me ask you, what do you think? Do you think we should take it more seriously? As a number of people have suggested, actually, that we should.
Well, the trouble is, Fiona, I'm going to actually say something you probably won't like, which is that if we are going to take it seriously, then I think we have to take it away from the BBC and put it maybe in ITV, who will glam it and glitz it up and put more effort into it, make a 2-month voting process to get the right thing. But, the BBC are not doing it any favours, apart from the delightful Graham Norton.
I have to say, I knew the BBC would get a kicking over the Dyson review, and quite rightly, I hadn't seen that coming, but Charlie, thank you. Tom?
I'm with Charlie. Let's have a brutal elimination contest all the way down until we finally find a singer who can actually get some cheers. You can only but laugh at how utterly appalling we are year after year. But you just certainly have to ask, why are we so disliked across Europe now that they give us literally...
I don't know, why do you think that could be?
That would be better addressed to Grant.
Well, reassuringly there, I don't think it's a recent thing, as you've been doing terribly in it for years and years. I mean, I don't know, what was the last one we won?
When did we last win? I might have it written down here.
In the
1997.
Katrina in the way.
Katrina, exactly.
Labour
Katrina in the way.
Labour government.
Of course. Things are going to get better, I remember. But look, I agree with the point about, if we're going to have a song which commands support, then actually it would make a lot of sense to put that in front of the public first and have a public vote on it first. I think the BBC is probably getting that wrong, but I think they are getting Graham Norton right. And I was just watching it, maybe just the end of it.
You're among friends, Grant. You can say that you had a Eurovision party.
All right,
Come
we
on.
stayed here. No, I just caught the end of it. And I just said to my wife, how do Eurovision even licence this and allow the BBC to just take the mickey out of it from beginning to end? It's amazing. And in the best British tradition, I think.
I was going to say, what makes it so fun? So let's have a referendum on the song that should go into the Eurovision. Let's have another referendum. Becky, what do you think?
No, I don't think that it should be taken too seriously. In fact, my favourite part of Eurovision is UK nil point, because it's just guaranteed to happen every single time. I think Iceland should have won, and we should all get pictures of our heads on our tops.
Oh, right, yes, of course, as they did. Or we wear very strange leather outfits with braces, as the Italians did, actually. Dale, what's your view?
Yeah, I don't know, really. I just think we should just have a laugh with it. Maybe put Adele on it. See what happens. See if we get a zero.
Put Adele on it?
Adele.
I was going to say, if Adele would do it, good luck with that. I think you might have trouble persuading her.
Yeah, and then I do agree. Maybe give it to the ITV and then, and see what happens on that one. But yeah, let Adele do it next year and see if she gets nil point on that front.
Yeah, good luck with that, ITV or whoever. I would bet you a lot of money would not succeed. Colette?
I'm just sitting here laughing alone, Fiona. I just want to say, Kate, sorry for your loss, my darling. I just wanted to say that. But no, absolutely, I loved Eurovision. You know, do we expect to get any points? Absolutely not. The whole of Europe hates us. But I think we should probably say back to Europe, well, I tell you what, we'll take our tourism away, you know, and see if we get any points then. But equally, I think it should stay where it is. I just think that we probably ought to get Simon Cowell involved. And get Cliff Richard back on there, then we'll win.
Right, okay. Nadra?
I thinking back to my childhood and watching that, you know, religiously with my parents and sitting and enjoying it, I think we can't take it too seriously. Something's obviously awry that we keep getting nil point, but it's an amazing evening for a lot of people who enjoy it. So we just should. There's so few moments to enjoy at this moment in time. I think it brought a smile to everybody's face as they watched it. Sad, one day we will win it. I am absolutely convinced.
Well, there was some BBC research that apparently songs in a minor key are 3 times more likely to win than in a major key.
That's right.
Who knew? So maybe that's where we're going right now. Emily, I know that you had a Eurovision party. Come on, confess.
I did have a Eurovision party. We did dishes from every single country in the finals. And I want to take this opportunity...
Hang on, how many dishes was that?
So it was, I don't remember how many it was. I mean, some of them were quite small. But I just want to take this opportunity...
30 or 40.
Yeah. I mean, like, the British one was gin. But I want to take this opportunity to apologise to the Portuguese, because lots of people on Twitter are very upset at my custard tarts that really weren't at all Portuguese. They just looked vaguely like Portuguese custard tarts, which I understand are very different. I love Eurovision. I love it every year. It's one of the highlights of my year, and I really don't mind us getting nil points. I think we have enough confidence in ourselves to allow people to laugh at us. I think probably a song in a minor key might be good, but the trouble is, if everybody realises that, it is going to make Eurovision really dreary. And I voted for Iceland, I have to say. I think they should have won. I agree with the putting your face on your shirts. No, big fan, and shame it's another year until we see it again.
Well, there we are. Our hour is up. Don't say we don't cover the whole gamut of topics on Question Time. Thank you very much to the panel for coming and joining us, and our desk, which I have to say, personally, I don't know about you. Good to have it back?
Yes, absolutely. Definitely.
Very good indeed. Nadra, thank you for joining us down the line. Very good to see you, and to our audience, our QT50. Very good to see you too this week. I will see, no doubt, some of your familiar faces next week as well. And to you at home, thank you so much for watching from Question Time. Bye-bye.